experiencing again. So disruption is a constant experience. And I'm going to be sharing some stories and some insights that I've gleaned from my recent master's research. And my hope is that I help allay some of the fear and anxiety that we have about what's ahead of us. And I'm going to be showing you that you've already been through this process, although it looks different. So hopefully we can address this and we can actually make it a little bit of an easier transition moving forward. So I'm not going to talk about disruption the way we have been talking about disruption, because when we've been talking about disruption historically and in the media, we talk about AI, and we talk about blockchain, and we talk about disrupting an industry, which I also want to just take a quick aside and say Mr. Christensen, who created the Innovator's Dilemma, where is it right there, and who wrote that book many years ago, just wants you to all know that you're actually using disruptive innovation in the wrong way, but that's a whole other talk. Anyway, I want to talk about disruption from a personal experience. And I know that disruption is something that we fear, and we fear it because there's this unknown on the other side of what's coming. We're creatures of habit. We like stability, we like routine, and these are the things that ground us. And right now, we are definitely not grounded the way we have been for most of our working lives. The routines that we had to start our day and get our families out the door, that's been disrupted. The routines we have and the routes that we take to work, clearly that's been disrupted. Our routes are definitely shorter now as we all stay at home and we work remotely from our organizations. And I want to talk about disruption so that we can address it and not make it quite so scary for us as we move forward. So I'm going to start that by sharing some stories. And I believe that our stories is how we create meaning. Other people obviously believe the same idea. I loved hearing Peter's story earlier in his talk, as well as Brant's, such a powerful and such a compelling story. And I think that this is going to help us understand disruption from a different lens. So the 80s power strut. Oh my God, I wanted to be Diane Keaton so bad. I really wanted to be her. I wanted that white coat. I wanted to be in marketing. I wanted to be in advertising. I wanted to be all the things that she was. And so this is pre-internet days in my experience. And in those days, if you wanted to find a job, you had to literally hit the pavement. And that's what I did. I got out the yellow pages. I figured out which advertising agencies were in my immediate area. And then I went and I applied for jobs and I got a job. And at the time I was working for the largest advertising agency in the world. And I was all of 19 years old. And I was working on some of the biggest accounts, on consumer package accounts and automotive accounts. And I started off as an account group secretary. And yes, I was very much a secretary at the time. And this was also the days where we could actually like smoke at our desks. So this is just giving you an indicator of just how long ago this was. So this was a really heady time, pretty much like in the 80s, everybody who worked in advertising was on coke or sleeping with their colleagues, quite frankly, present company excluded, thank you very much. But I was super young and I was super naive. And I was so engaged with this idea of teamwork, and I loved the collaboration, and I loved just pitching in. I had days that ran 12, 14 hours long. It didn't matter. I loved doing the work. And then I had an executive that I worked with cross a line and proposition me. And he didn't just cross a line. I mean, he kissed me. And things went pretty much downhill right from that moment. I was devastated. And I went home and I took the next day off of work. And then I went into work the following day and I gave a month's notice to my boss. And my boss looked at me and he knew that something was going wrong. And he took the time to really get me to relieve some of my anxiety with him. And I eventually told him what had happened. And this is what had happened. So he took my message and he took it to the president's office, and I walked into the president's office, and then very shortly thereafter, I was given a check for 2 weeks and I was summarily dismissed out the door. So for many women, this is not going to be a surprising story. But that experience completely derailed me. It completely disrupted me for 4 years. I was a 19-year-old girl who had gotten a job in advertising with the largest agency that there was in the world. And then all of a sudden, I was no longer in that space. I left that space and I ended up doing frontline service jobs, like the very important people who are doing those kinds of jobs today. And in that time frame, I met the wrong guy, I got the right kid, and I chose a different path forward from there. So I reorganized myself and I decided to get myself back to university, except for this time I was going to take a 2.5-year-old with me in tow. So at the time I was paying for school with student loans and receiving social assistance. And I had a 5-year plan. My 5-year plan was to do a double major in economics and women's studies so I could be a feminist bitch with an attitude about money too. And I was going to get that honors BA. Well, unfortunately, in year 2 of my program, the provincial government, where I live in Ontario, decided to do 21% of cuts to social assistance. And that basically took away my grocery money, which meant that I could no longer stay in school, and I had to leave and I had to go back to work. So that was another catastrophic event in my life. Completely derailed me, completely disrupted every single plan that I'd have. So what I did in the meantime was, I continued with my learning. I did a paralegal diploma to figure out that I didn't want to do law full time. And then I fell into jobs until I found my way, and Dan will appreciate this, into telecom. I loved telecom. Telecom in the 90s was just building and growing, and it was a monstrous industry, and it taught me literally everything. I was such an uber nerd at one point, I literally could translate binary, and I can tell you what that binary looks like on this slide, but I'll leave that one up to you. I became really self-taught in this industry. I started off in sales. I moved into education and then operations, new product design, and marketing at the national level. And I stayed with the organization that I was with. Actually, let me say this. I never changed employers for my first gig in telecom, but I had 8 different business cards because in the 90s, it was nothing but just purchasing, and everybody got acquired at one point or another. But then I ended up being in the industry, all told, for about 15 years. And then unfortunately, I had another experience with sexual harassment in that environment. And it completely disrupted the path that I thought that I was on for my career. And it was, quite frankly, traumatic and emotionally devastating. It was really hard to have a trusting relationship with somebody, to have that person thwart you. And then I used to call it the reel in and the reel out, where somebody would reel you in and engage with you. And then as soon as I would not allow, to lines to be crossed, then he would reel me out and he wouldn't allow me to be at the table presenting my own ideas to executives. So you can tell from this picture, this was taken around that time, I was just not a happy person. I got actually really sick and I ended up being critically ill, and I ended up being hospitalized for 5 days, which took me 2 months to recover from. And it was discovered at the time that I have an autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis, which was brand new to me and was a completely new way for me to consider moving forward. So again, another disruptive experience in my life. But what this did for me is it spurred me into a deep desire to move towards a new path and new career opportunities. Because as I'm sure Dan can also attest, once you've been in telecom for 15 years, you almost start to forget everything that you knew. And it was time for me to move into a new space. So, I was never a title seeker. I was never a goal seeker in that way. I was always just moving in a direction. And like many people in Gen X, my career path has not been linear. It has been all over the place, but it's been really satisfying in many, many ways. Some jobs are about the people and some jobs were about the work. And I've worked in different kinds of roles, from communications to business development, strategy, marketing, education, operations, and I've held roles from director to COO. And what I realized when I was stepping out of the industry is that I needed to take a new tact with how I wanted to move forward. So I ended up working in the innovation space, and I was in the innovation space for about 3 years, specifically working with hubs in Toronto. And the problem was, though, is that I was living in a small city that was well, in theory, it was an hour and a half from the city, but really ended up being a 6-hour commute for me daily, every time I had to come into the office and into work, and which was great. And I loved it, and I didn't mind it whatsoever. And I have an amazing partner here at home, and he was able to do the lift for me while I was pursuing this kind of new path for myself. But commuting 3,200 hours in 3 years is pretty exhausting. So I decided to change tact again, and I was looking to work closer to home. And as I said, I was living in a small city, and I'd applied for a job that I was well overqualified for, and I'd been frankly doing a lot of the free labor for about 13 years. And then instead of getting an opportunity at the job, I went to the biggest real estate guy's wife. And that's when I really just decided that I needed to completely disrupt my life intentionally. So what we did was we sold the house, we moved cities, and I was confident that I was going to find a new job. I didn't even worry about it for a second. And then something happened when I hit 46. I couldn't get a job. I was once called the most connected person in Toronto, and I couldn't get hired. So this was, again, a massive disruption to my career. It was devastating. I had a whole range of emotions and feelings going on, a lot of doubt, a lot of fear, a lot of rejection, absolutely. And really the only thing worse than having a career disruption at 46 is also going through menopause at the same time, and that's another whole conversation. So, and still, it did piss me off, pretty much piss me off, but I'm ever the optimist. So I decided to forge a new way forward for myself again. So I chose a different way and I applied for grad school. So 23 years after I should have been there in the first place, but I was back on track. So this is my school, Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia, which is also Deadpool's house and X-Men school. So it's a pretty awesome place. And I was really lucky to be accepted into the School for Leadership Studies. And that's what my master's program was all about, was about leadership. And we say it was about leadership, but really it was about systems. And it was about systems and systems change, and positive systems change, to be more specific as well. So we spent a lot of time in this program being reflective and looking at ourselves as leaders, looking at ourselves as learners, and then how do we show up in the system? So as a quick aside, systems thinking is something that's been around since the 50s. It's an interdisciplinary study, and it's a really holistic way of looking at any kind of environment with a very specific focus on relationships. If you heard Roger Martin talking from a design thinking perspective, he's definitely a proponent of system thinking. And design thinking is really something that just is attacked on the systems theory that exists out there. So throughout my program and throughout my learning, I happened upon this book. And this book had been sitting on my bookshelf for years. That was the first kind of thing that really struck me. And then books that were referenced in this book were also sitting on my bookshelf, which I thought, serendipity. Everything is starting to come together and crystallize for me. And it was in this book that I was really availed to this accessible approach to complexity theory and social innovation. And I learned that social transformation can happen at two levels, individually and at the organizational level. And this is where I actually really learned about the roots of this notion of creative destruction. Now, I'd heard about the phrase creative destruction forever. My friend Jesse Rogers actually started the creative destruction lab with the U of T. So I was well versed in kind of what the intent was behind it, but it was really interesting to get the real feedback, or the real background rather, about this whole notion. And that was about Joseph Schumpeter, who was an economist and a professor in the 40s. And he said, quote, that the capitalism can only be understood as an evolutionary process of continuous innovation and creative destruction. And what he basically meant was, you have to have this destructive nature within the cycle of business so that you can actually give birth to these innovative ideas. He also, by the way, believes that capitalism would gradually weaken and it will collapse, but that's another whole conversation. So then I was also introduced to C.S. Halling, Buzz Halling, who is a Canadian ecologist. And he was taking a very integrative approach to looking at systems. And he was looking at economic growth and human development and natural systems. And as I mentioned, systems thinking is a very interdisciplinary platform. And so he was looking for patterns, and he was building these kinds of theories around resilience, which he says is like the core characteristic of any healthy system, and complexity theory. And so the great example that he uses is a forest. So we now know that because we've identified and we've looked at forest fires and we've looked at the life cycle of a forest over many, many decades, we know that, when you have a devastating event in a forest fire, it actually becomes an opportunity for growth for the forest, that there's a rebirth process that happens in there. And so when you've looked at an ecosystem long enough, you can see that there's like this cyclical pattern of behaviors. A forest fire we may not be able to time it, but we know that this is actually a natural state and it's a natural part of this particular ecosystem. So it was Halling who was looking for these patterns in natural systems. And then he was seeing things from like Schumpeter, and he's looking at this interdisciplinary approach. And he was, looking at all of these kinds of inputs. And what I realized is that the models of dealing with natural systems that Halling identified can actually be looked at both a macro and a micro lens. So stick with me, because this is all going to be making sense shortly. So when I was looking at these macro tools that Halling had identified, he created this model that has 4 kind of distinct phases of what an ecosystem goes through, or what a system will go through. And they look like this. They're called release, reorganization, exploitation, and conservation. And I want us to look at what happens in each one of these different stages, because I want you to be able to identify how this macro tool can actually be totally relatable on a micro scale. And this is called the adaptive cycle, obviously. So this is a very iterative and constantly moving cycle. And what that means is that you can be experiencing 2 cycles at any given time. So as an individual, you could be experiencing the adaptive cycle. And then if you're part of an organization could be going through an entirely different part of the cycle, but you're still part of that ecosystem as well. So let's break this down a little bit and see what I mean by these different phases. So in the release phase, what happens is that you usually have a catastrophic event, something like COVID-19, or a divorce, or a death, or you've lost your job. And usually what happens is an external push, and what happens is all of the resources that you were holding in that previous state are now literally released. They get to, so whether that's your time, your energy, your money, that all gets to be released, and it gets to be put toward a new future. And then you move from the release phase into the reorganization phase. And what does reorganization look like? Exactly what it sounds like. Here's new opportunities. There's tons of opportunities. There's so many ideas. You have all the ideas. You want to do all the things. But there is a caveat here that we have to pay attention to. And that's because there's a thing here called the poverty trap. And what that means is you either may not have the resources you need to move to the next stage, or you don't make any decisions. And so you kind of sit in this hold, right? This could be from an individual perspective. This could be anxiety and depression or stagnation. Or it could be just a lack of decisiveness, and it's really hard. The important thing to remember is that this doesn't have to be your forever state. So I had a pattern that I would turn to in my single mom days, which was always, if something ever went wrong, I had to go with clothes on my back, food in my belly, roof over my head. And so when I was approaching this model, looking at the poverty trap, what I realized is like, those are the things that I needed to make sure were taken care of before I could actually move forward with anything. So it's somewhat of a hold pattern, but it's also a good caveat for anyone to pay attention to. So the problem in the poverty trap, of course, is that nothing necessarily takes root, and you could have, as I mentioned already, those insufficient resources to move into the next phase. And the next phase is the exploitation phase. And that exploitation phase, I know some people have a really hard time with the word exploitation. They feel really uncomfortable with it. But I want you to put a more positive spin on it. This is when you get to actually grow your ideas. You've come out of the reorganization phase, you've made a decision, and you know where you're going forward now. So whether it's from an organizational perspective or whether it's an individual perspective, this is when you get to take all of those resources that were released, and you get to actually put them into a new framework, and you get to move them forward however you want to see them move forward. And then we move into the conservation phase. And in that conservation phase, this is just where everything is just like status quo. Everything is working, and we're going to make sure that everything is sustained, and we're going to sustain things right here. So it doesn't mean that there's a lot of growth happening, or doesn't mean that there is, a lot of movement happening. Everything is just being held in place. Well, guess what? There's another caveat that has to happen here, and that's called the rigidity trap. And that's the way I interpret it is, it's when we're hanging on to something, even if it's no longer working for us, right? We're fear letting go of something because this works, why change, right? Because I do believe that, we are driven by the pleasure principle, that we don't purposefully and intentionally put ourselves in way of disruption, not if we don't have to, but that's a whole other master's research. So we have to release these resources, because then we can't do anything if we're still holding off in this stagnant place. So again, this adaptive cycle is an iterative and continuous space. And I just want to be like here. I'm giving a very, very short version on like tomes of work and tons of nuance that actually, you know, can lead you down many, many beautiful, delicious, intelligent rabbit holes. But for our intents and purposes, this is really just about identifying that this is a cycle that has been proven from an economic theory perspective, from a natural systems perspective, sociology, archaeology. It's been proven over and over again. And so what we can learn from paying attention to this cycle is that if we take the time to learn what's happening, if we take the time to see what's happening, and if we take the time to be present to what's happening, then we can anticipate what's happening. So now what? What do we do with this information? That's a nice story, Karen. You told a whole bunch of stories. Well, I want you to go through an exercise. So Tim is going to add on a link into the chat that's going to have a worksheet there, and anyone can download that worksheet. And I have an exercise for you. Don't worry, this is homework. You can work on it yourself. But I want you to think of a situation in your past. I want you to sit down and think about, when were you disrupted? What happened? Who was there? How did you feel? What surprised you at each stage? So I'm going to run you through an example that I put together about my own experience so that you can help fill this out for yourself. So, started off in the release phase. This was for me. Career disruption, sold my house, and then I moved cities. And then I moved straight into the reorg phase, and I was ready to go get jobs. But you know what? I was stuck in that poverty trap. And you know what my poverty trap was? I was applying for jobs that I didn't want. I knew I didn't want to work at those companies, and I wasn't getting the job, surprise, surprise, because I wasn't showing up as my authentic self, and I wasn't showing up wholeheartedly. So then I moved into my reorganization phase, which was I decided to apply to grad school. And I said no to the jobs I didn't want. And I said yes to consulting. And it was one of the best decisions, of course, I ever made in my life. And I was being really true to myself in that regard. And then I moved into the exploitation phase. And the exploitation phase was fantastic. I was consulting full time. I was working with friends. I was able to fire clients that I didn't want to work with, who didn't hold my same values. And I was studying towards my MA. And then I moved into the conservation phase. And in that conservation phase, I was doing my master's research, which is called Women Disrupted. You can find it at .com or .ca. And I decided to take on a full-time role with my primary client. My rigidity trap was I ended up staying with that client when I should have left that client a long time ago, but I was staying for the money. Well, then guess what happened to me? I got disrupted. So in this process, when you walk through this exercise, I want to encourage you to ask yourself these questions. So, what happened? And how did you feel? And what surprised you? And who was there and who wasn't there? And what happened next? Because I want you to be able to start to identify if you have patterns of behavior, or if people in your life show up a pattern as well. And identify what happened to you at each stage. And I think it'll be a lot easier than you think it may be. So as I've said before, this has all happened before, and it will happen again. And so just so we're all very clear, right now, we're all here. Right now, we're all in this stage. We're all facing this whole experience of release. We're all being very disrupted. And it is a very kind of compelling and tragic thing. However, I want to remind you, though, that you were having an experience before COVID-19 and the stay-at-home initiatives were put in place. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at that past experience, and now I want you to sit down and say, where are you in the present? Because not everybody has been disrupted the same way. Not everybody has lost their job. Not everybody is stay-at-home, and some people are frontline or essential workers, right? So I want you to map where you are currently on your path, because then what I say is that if you can anticipate where you are, or whether you can identify where you are, you can anticipate what's coming next, and you can be better prepared for what's coming down the line. Because this way, you aren't so afraid of what's coming because you have an idea that it's coming. So more questions, but a little bit more centered in the now. So how are you feeling now? And what's surprising you now? And who is here and who's not here? And are you seeing patterns that you've lived through before? Are those patterns that you want to keep seeing, or are they patterns that you want to let go? So I know that this is a disruptive time. I know that this is a scary time. And I'm happy to have a conversation, answer any questions. I want to talk about this idea of disruption and help us all approach it with a little bit more intention and a little bit more forward thinking, so that we don't feel like we're actually reacting to everything around us, and that we can feel like we're taking a little bit more control as how we move forward. Thanks so much. And I've got some slides, some sources here that we can add on, that are actually in that PDF that that Tim has shared, and hopefully they'll be valuable resources for you. Thanks.
KSD, oh my gosh. All right, so I got a couple questions for you, and
Sure.
then we'll see what we got from the chat or from the Q&A here. And don't forget to use Q&A on the panel over there, folks. Okay, so there are arguably like degrees of accepting disruptive change, right? So your comfort level of both being disruptive and initiating the disruption. So if we kind of look at these two, where disruption sort of happens to you, with the company's been acquired, or the company's acquired another company, and all of a sudden now you're being disrupted because the leader said, we're doing this as well as that now. So there's that type of disruption.
Sure.
Then there's the one where you embark on, right? You're trying to potentially push forward, as you've described, right? In some of the great dialogue, with the I need to disrupt myself kind of mode, right? So where I'm trying to go with this question is, do you have like advice is there anything different you'd suggest when it's happening to you, the disruption's happening, and you have to almost accept it, but also go through the process of disruption and what am I going to do about this? Like you did with telecomics, so you're like, okay, something else, right? It's happened to me. I'm going to do something else now. And you also have wonderful examples of disrupting yourself and disrupting elsewhere because you're handling it. So just curious how you take that question.
Sure. So really the question I actually have still is, do we ever actually intentionally disrupt ourselves? And I don't think that we do, frankly. I think that we are always reacting, and I feel like we're always responding. This is just like, you know, my very early, this is something worth studying 100%, right? But it is, I feel like we are always reacting to the world around us, and that we are responding to the things that are happening. And we may make decisions and choices like I have at different points, right? Like to go to grad school. But frankly, had my previous pattern of like going to get a job because that's what I was supposed to do had gone the way it was supposed to, I probably wouldn't have applied to grad school, right? Because I was going along in the pattern that was already working for me. So like, I'm not a Freudian, but I do believe in the pleasure principle. And I don't believe that everything we do, right, is about bringing ourselves pleasure, right? The people that we're with, you know, the food we eat, the wine we drink, the music we listen to, the clothes we wear, the scents we wear, all of it is about that derision or the deriving pleasure. And so disruption is not pleasurable, right? It is a really hard thing. Change is the most exhausting thing for most people to go through, right? So really, I ask the question is, are we ever really disrupting ourselves, or is it always a reaction to some external input? And frankly, also, Dan, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to put together this, you know, this kind of a workshop, because I think if we can say, and we can see where we are on our current path, right? We can look where we are on that cycle, then we can actually make intentional decisions about how do we move forward. And I think that that's the opportunity here.
Isn't that interesting? Well, a pal of mine, and I would say one of our nation's treasures in terms of being a futurist is Chuck Hamilton. If you've never met Chuck, you should. He's based out there in Tawasin, BC. So in the chat here, he says, the winners going forward will be those who take this COVID shift opportunity to reorganize for the next stage of human evolution. Those that go back to where we were will lose.
Chuck is my best friend. I love that, Chuck. Absolutely. I am, you know, and listen, I want to acknowledge something. I mean, I'm sitting deeply in many, many seats of privilege. And, you know, I have a spouse who is gainfully employed. You know, I have a home, I have food, I am not in peril every day. You know, that is beyond, like, that's just baseline privilege, beyond like kind of like the, you know, the race privilege I have and everything else that I experience. And at the same time, I am also ever hopeful. I mean, I said I was a pissed off optimist, right? I'm ever hopeful of the fact that that I think that this is the opportunity to actually do those massive shifts. I mean, even if you just look at the question of universal basic income, and yes, no model right now is perfect the way it's being presented, but the reality is we've just proven unequivocally that a basic income is a human right, and when the entire world is 2 paychecks away from poverty, right? So I am ever hopeful that this is a new dialogue, and not a new dialogue, but an opportunity for people who want to do this positive social change, right, for themselves or for their organizations, whatever that looks like, for profit, not for profit, you know, community work, whatever, that it's an opportunity for us to take a stance and not allow this narrative to die and not allow it to just go by the wayside. I'm a firm believer in that position.
Well, while I have you, I have a societal question as it relates to the pandemic and it disrupting us, but us sort of flipping it on its head and saying, let's disrupt society. And that is, do you think that, Karen, we may be able, or we may be seeing the return to community? And do you think this is the opportunity for, or do you think people will aspire to invest more in their community than perhaps they ever have done before, and sort of disrupt the old world of MNC and kind of globalization and actually disrupt it for the good of community in which we live, be it Dundas, Victoria, Tawasin, you know, Colorado Springs, wherever people are today?
Totally. So there's a great social innovator by the name of Zita Cobb, who is a brilliant woman who actually started the Fogo Island Inn in Newfoundland, and she is also the head of Shore Fast, which is a community venture. And she defines community as having a shared experience in place. For her, community is in place. And I kind of balked at that because I was in digital and social for a long, long time, you know, and there's this whole idea about, you know, about building community online, right? And so I was like, you know, but that's those feelings that you get when it is online and whatnot. But I agree with her the more I actually dig into this, because there's a shared fate, right, in our communities. And, you know, the things that make, so I live in Dundas, the thing that makes Dundas so beautiful and that everyone goes, oh, Dundas, I love Dundas. It's so sweet, it's so quaint and everything else. It's this beautiful little downtown we have that is filled with beautiful little shops and coffee spots and restaurants and whatnot. And it's communal, and people come out, and I see my MP walking down the street downtown. You know, I see people locally all the time. If we don't sustain our communities, that is going to be the greatest loss through this COVID pandemic. And I agree, Dan, I think that it is the opportunity, and I think that there is going to be a resurgence about being local. There's another whole conversation, honestly, about kind of the cyclical nature of our buying patterns. But I do believe that we're kind of being shifted back to this, as we were getting ready to move into this more kind of like extreme shopping and extreme consumer habits. I feel like we're going back into that nesting phase out of necessity, but also because it's our community stores, it's our small businesses. I mean, small businesses are being devastated in Canada and in the US, and those are the ones that actually need the support. And that's only going to happen if we all show up and support them locally.
Well, maybe that's what the great disruption will be, a return to community, something we may call the Great Reset, right?
And if we can see it, then we can be intentional about it.
Yeah, indeed. Listen, you're a gem. Thank you so much for volunteering, for delivering such a great talk. I hope Victor is safe in helping out those in such a dire straits where we are. I mean, getting people not in the hospitals and preventing them that way. I mean, what Victor does is just it's just amazing. With that, we're going to wrap it up for today. We are at the end of day 3. Thanks for joining in. SpeakAid 2020. We're here for raising money for Red Cross, Red Crescent. Thanks to all those that did. I did do a final check. We're at $22.50 for the day. It's pretty good. Really enjoying this. Hoping we can push past 20 grand by the end of the week. Thanks so much, Karen. Again, thank you. Best to Victor. And we'll see you tomorrow, I hope, at SpeakAid day 4. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.